Chapter 22:51. While the father and son of the Lawn family were chatting, there was a disaster in the kitchen. Cher had never done any housework, and she didn't want to appear incompetent in front of her mother-in-law, so she put in a lot of effort and even helped Xiao Yishu. It was a disaster for the mother and son to be together. Madame Lawn held her forehead and didn't know what to say. Cher stared blankly at the pea-sized potato, then carefully looked at Madame Lawn. She bit her lip and said a little embarrassedly, "This can be cooked, right?" Madame Land's face twitched. It was rare for her to smile so lovingly. "They're so cute." Cher lowered her head even more, and then she covered her eyes with a pair of chubby hands. Xiao Yishu said in a childish voice, "Mommy likes cute things the most." Lan Yishu. Cher glared at the little girl. Xiao Yishu threw herself into Madame Land's arms, and she immediately became a drama queen. "Grandma, Mommy is bullying me." Madame Lawn smiled and patted her. "Grandma is here. Mommy wouldn't dare." Cher looked at her and peeled another bowl of potatoes and soybeans. Madame Lawn looked at her and sighed. No wonder Lan Yu liked her and wanted to marry her. She was the one who gave birth to Lan Yu, and she knew his character very well. He had always been cold. It wasn't that he hadn't been pursued by good-looking ladies, and he had dated women before, but they didn't last long. On the other hand, he had always doted on his sister, Lan Ting. But when she thought of Lan Ting, Madame Lan felt sad. If she hadn't sent Lan Ting abroad, Lan Ting wouldn't have been in trouble. She would still be alive and well, and she would still be as innocent and cute as Cher. She was really afraid that Lan Yu loved Cher as Ting Ting, and he didn't really like her. As Madame Lan thought about this, she couldn't help but feel a little sad. However, she soon let it go. It had been so many years, and it was time to let go of everything. Lan Yu should have let go of everything as well. She looked at Cher with a loving gaze. Besides, Xiao Yishu was so cute. Although he was a little boy, he was simply a replica of Cher. Madame Lawn didn't doubt their relationship at all, because Yishu and Cher looked alike. After dinner, Cher went out with Madame Lawn to socialize. She introduced Cher to Madame Land's old friends, but the main point was that Madame Lawn brought her precious grandson to show off. After a few rounds of afternoon tea, Cher and Xiao Yishu returned to the Lawn family with round bellies. Madame Lawn was in extremely good mood. Who said that their Lan Yu wasn't interested in women? Who said that artists were weird? Who said that he only liked men? Now, his little wife was even more beautiful than anyone else's. Madame Lawn was very happy. She had a lot of words to share with her Lao Lan. Besides, she was a little reluctant to part with her grandson, so she asked Lan Yu and Cher to stay in the old house for one night with the child. Lan Yu didn't refuse. Cher naturally couldn't say anything. However, she didn't expect that Madame Lawn would carry Xiao Yishu to their bedroom to sleep, saying that she wanted to tell her grandson a story. Cher didn't know whether to laugh or cry, but she had no choice but to stay. At 9 o'clock in the evening, she stood in the bedroom with Lan Yu. She bit her finger. Bed or sofa? Lan Yu glanced at her and walked to the bathroom. The bed is very big. It's enough for 2 people to sleep in. Lan Yu, she called softly behind him. He looked back at her. Chapter 22:52. Lan Yu's gaze was unfathomable. After looking at her for a moment, he said calmly, "I won't touch you. Don't worry." He said it so bluntly that Cher's face heated up. Oh, she couldn't reject him like that. If she insisted, it would seem as though she had a guilty conscience. She watched as Lan Yu entered the bathroom. She turned back to look at the bedroom. It was a typical male bedroom with a dark gray color scheme. It should be where Lan Yu used to live. She wasn't used to it because it was filled with Lan Yu's scent. She had lived with him for 5 to 6 years, but she still felt a little unfamiliar with him. She couldn't quite imagine sleeping on his bed. She thought she would lose sleep. Lan Yu showered for about 10 minutes before walking out in a white bathrobe. She had to admit that he was a very good-looking man. Sometimes, she couldn't figure out if there was something wrong with his body that was why he was willing to stay in a marriage that was in name but not in reality. Perhaps his heart had been broken by a woman? What are you thinking about? Lan Yu looked over indifferently. Go take a shower. It's getting late. Oh, Cher replied and immediately ran in as though she was escaping. Lan Yu stood behind her. His gaze was deep and unfathomable. Cher ran into the bathroom and shut herself in immediately. Her heart was heaving up and down violently. She didn't know why, but she was a little afraid of Lan Yu now. She felt that he was a little different from before. His gaze often made her feel a sense of predation. He wasn't as innocent as before. When she soaked in the warm water, the anxiety in her heart was soothed. But then, she wanted to go berserk again, because she had forgotten to take her clothes. The clothes she had changed out were already soaked in water and couldn't be worn anymore. Cher wanted to cry. She grabbed her half-dry hair. Why was she so stupid? After showering, she wrapped herself in a towel and carefully opened a gap in the door. She called out to Lan Yu, "Do you have any clothes to change into?" Lan Yu was sitting on the sofa, working on his laptop. When he heard her voice, he looked up with a deep gaze. Then he smiled, walked into the changing room, took out a shirt, and handed it to her. "Just put it on." Cher took it and swallowed. "Aren't you going to give me a pair of pants?" Lan Yu's gaze was a little deep. "Just make do with it and wear it as pajamas." After Cher put it on, it was indeed up to her knees. Everything that should be covered was covered. Relieved, she opened the door and walked out. Lan Yu seemed to have finished his work. He walked over and handed her a glass of milk. "Drink some milk and go to bed early." Cher took it and looked at his indifferent expression. She also relaxed. Lan Yu wasn't any different from before. She was probably thinking too much. So she drank the glass of milk and nodded. "Then I'll go to bed first. Don't stay up too late." It was a little uncomfortable to lie in the same bed, so she asked him to sleep a little later. Half an hour later, Lan Yu looked at the little pig that had fallen asleep. His gaze became deep. She was wearing his white shirt and lying on his bed. She was stunningly beautiful, like the most beautiful painting. He knew that she had never fallen in love with him. At most, she only saw him as family. And recently, she must have felt uneasy in her heart. She was more perceptive than him. Chapter 2253. Lan Yu's gaze was deep as he looked at Cher's quiet little face. He knew that she wouldn't wake up no matter what he did. There were 2 sleeping pills in that glass of milk. It was enough for her to sleep until noon the next day. He held her with one hand and took his phone with the other. He adjusted the angle and took a few photos. After that, he took a few photos of her alone. Those photos were very aesthetically pleasing. After all, Lan Yu was an artist and had a certain sense of beauty, especially when Cher was lying on the dark-colored bedsheets with her body turned sideways and only wearing a shirt. Her tender look made Lan Yu unable to take his eyes off her. He had always known that she was a beautiful person. However, after 5 years, it wasn't that he didn't have any desire for her. It was just that it was very, very little. Even if there was a little, he would suppress it. At this moment, facing such a seductive photo, he wouldn't be a man if he didn't have any reaction. His slender fingers touched her face, but he retracted them abruptly. Lan Yu's face was filled with depression. In the end, he fled and solved it himself in the bathroom. When Cher woke up and opened her eyes, it was almost noon. Naturally, Lan Yu wasn't in the room anymore. She looked around and finally reached out to block the sunlight and stretched. She was so tired. It was as if she had been working for a few days and nights. Even now, her body was very tired. She sat up and realized that there was a paper bag beside the bed. It was a brand that she often wore. She reached out to take it and flipped through it. A set of clothes was neatly prepared. This brand of clothes was quite expensive. At least, it wasn't something that the little artist, A&N, could afford. However, for the past few years, Lan Yu had taken good care of her and provided her with the same lifestyle as before. Sometimes, she really couldn't understand why he didn't find a woman who was willing to serve him wholeheartedly when he had so much money. It was enough for her to kneel down and lick him. She had asked him before, and he said it was because Xiao Yishu liked her. Therefore, in Lan Yu's place, Cher positioned herself as a top-notch nanny, and she enjoyed his top-notch care with a peace of mind. She changed her clothes, washed her face, and went downstairs. She felt a little guilty because this was the first time she spent the night in the Lan family's house, and she slept until noon. Although she was a fake wife, she couldn't lose face for Lan Yu. She tiptoed downstairs. The villa was so quiet that there was almost no sound. Just as she was relaxing, Lan Yu's voice suddenly sounded. "You're awake?" Cher was startled. She nodded and looked around. "Where's Ishu?" Lan Yu sat on the sofa and seemed to be drawing something in a sketchbook. He looked up and said, "My mom took him to a social gathering." As a grandmother, she would never complain that her grandson did not have enough appearances. Yesterday, he had only seen 3 groups of old sisters. How was that enough? The moment Cher heard that, she let out a long sigh. "Ishu, it's been hard on you." Lan Yu lowered his head and drew a few more random strokes before closing the notebook. Looking at the clothes she had changed into, he said calmly, "The servants at home are on vacation. What do you want to eat later?" Cher's eyes widened. Why are they on vacation? She was a little puzzled. Today wasn't some festival. Lan Yu walked closer slowly and looked at her. He smiled. "My mom said that she wants to have a grandchild and rule the world." Cher couldn't help but burst out laughing. "I'm dying of laughter. Lan Yu, your mom has a much better sense of humor than you. Do you think that I'm boring?" Lan Yu asked suddenly. Chapter 2254. "What about Yi Muyan?" He asked in surprise. She wasn't the only one who was surprised. He was surprised too. His question was full of jealousy, and it couldn't be more obvious. Cher pursed her lips and smiled faintly. "It's been too long. I've forgotten." With that, she walked out the door. "Didn't you say we were going out for dinner? I'm a little hungry." Her attitude showed that she didn't want to talk about Yi Muyan, and the more she tried to avoid it, the more she cared about it. Lan Yu reached out to hold her. When she turned back, he could see the anger in her eyes clearly. In her heart, she was still in love with that man, and he could see it clearly. And she had hidden this feeling in her heart. She had made up her mind to be a fake couple with him for the rest of her life, right? Lan Yu's eyes were burning with a small flame, but he hid it instantly. He looked down and said faintly, "I'm going up to change." Cher heaved a sigh of relief. "I'll wait for you here." She sat on the sofa, picked up his sketchbook, and flipped through it. Lan Yu walked upstairs. His gaze swept past her, and he didn't say anything. He just slowly went upstairs. Cher sat and flipped to the page of his drawing. She was a little surprised. She looked up, but she couldn't see Lan Yu. He had gone upstairs to change. Her gaze fell back to the drawing. After looking at it for a long time, she chose not to say anything and put the sketchbook down. It was just that her heart was pounding, as if she had peeped into his heart. Or did he let her see it on purpose? She wasn't sure, so she didn't make a sound when she got into his car. She also didn't realize that they were wearing the same color today, which could be said to be a couple's outfit. Lan Yu held the steering wheel and asked casually, "Where do you want to eat?" "You decide," Cher said a little absent-mindedly. Lan Yu smiled. "I know a good restaurant." Snow grunted in acknowledgement. Her current mood was that it didn't matter where she ate. But she didn't expect that Lan Yu would take her to the restaurant opened by Zhao Yin. Zhao Yin was also there, but he didn't play. Instead, he leaned against the bar counter and chatted with Qin Mu. Qin Mu lived with Zhou Chongwang, but she was still very close to Zhao Yin. Because of this, Zhou Chongwang was quite annoyed. Did he not know how to play the piano? Why did she always come out to listen to Zhao Yin play? Zhao Zi said something very painful, because Zhao Yin plays better than you. After that, Zhou Zong began to practice the zither day after day, but Qin Mu still didn't pay attention to him. She still ran outside all day and hung out with Zhao Yin. At this moment, when she saw Cher coming over with Lan Yu, she couldn't help but be a little stunned. After a while, she said softly, "Zhao Yin, you knew about it, didn't you?" She felt quite complicated. Cher came back and lived with her brother, and even had sex with him. She thought that they had a good chance of being together. After all, her brother and Song Karen had broken up, hadn't they? Zhao Yin smiled. "No, I don't. No, I never knew about it. I only found out recently, not earlier than you guys. Even my brother, Tang Yu, didn't know about it." When he said that Tang Yu was his brother, he was still a little embarrassed. The age difference was too big. To Zhao Yin, Tang Yu wasn't just a brother, he was like a father. Chapter 2255. When Cher saw Qin Mu, she was a little surprised. Because when Qin Mu and Zhao Yin were together, they didn't have any taboos. Did something happen between her and Zhao Yin? If something really happened between them, she would have to call Qin Mu Annie in the future. How messy. However, Cher couldn't care less about that. She just smiled faintly and walked in with Lan Yu. They picked a seat and sat down. Holding her chin, she looked at the menu and asked Lan Yu, "How did you know about this restaurant?" Lan Yu smiled. "It was reported in the New York Times. Don't forget that your uncle is also a celebrity." Cher looked up and said, "Oh," but she didn't say anything else. After she ordered, Lan Yu went to the restroom. When he came back, Qin Mu was already sitting at their table. Lan Yu smiled faintly and bent down to kiss Cher on the forehead. "Can you introduce me?" Cher looked up. She had placed all of her attention on her forehead. The warmth made her feel a little uneasy. She didn't know why Lan Yu would do that. She was stunned. Then, Lan Yu reached out and touched her gently. "Cher." Cher came back to her senses and introduced uncomfortably. "This is Qin Mu, my childhood playmate." Before she could continue, Lan Yu had already introduced himself. "I'm Lan Yu, A&N's husband. We've been married for 5 years." Qin Mu took in a deep breath, while Shui was in a sorry state. Lan Yu smiled. "Since you are Cher's friend, why don't we share a table and invite Zhao Yan?" He asked Cher in a very gentle manner, just like a gentle husband. Cher wouldn't embarrass him in such an occasion. Moreover, he really didn't do anything out of line, so she couldn't reject him. But she also knew that the atmosphere Lan Yu created was that of a loving couple. She didn't know if he was doing it on purpose, but she felt uncomfortable and depressed. Qin Mu was also a little uncomfortable. Even if she wanted to move, she would lose her composure. She could only look at Zhao Yan and smile helplessly. Zhao Yan's position was different from hers, because he was Cher's uncle. Now that the rice was cooked, and the child was already 5 years old, he had to accept the truth. Everyone had to accept it, including Yi Muyun. However, Zhao Yan's inner monologue was like this: "I really didn't expect that I would underestimate her. She actually dared to play outside of marriage." And the other party was even Yi Muyun, the high and mighty Mr. Yi. When Mr. Yi saw her return and sent Song Karen flying, he probably wanted to strangle her to death when he found out that Cher was married. Zhao Yan smiled mysteriously and occasionally looked at Qin Mu. Qin Mu couldn't stay calm. Everyone knew what she was thinking, otherwise she wouldn't stay by Zhou Chongwang's side with peace of mind. Qin Mu kept a straight face and looked at Cher and Lan Yu, trying to find something. But in the end, she could only come to one conclusion, and that was that Lan Yu was the perfect husband. She was a little desperate. Her brother was probably finished. There was no hope. Think about it. Her brother was so fierce to Cher, but in comparison, Lan Yu was much more considerate and respectful after the meal. Qin Mu left first, feeling a little confused. Zhao Yan saw that she was a little uneasy, so he finally decided to send her back. In the car, Qin Mu held her forehead with her fingers and said softly, "Zhao Yan, take me home." Zhao Yan nodded. Chapter 2256. Zhao Yan smiled and gave her a tissue. "Qin Mu, you look like you're going to cry." Qin Mu looked a little embarrassed and turned her face away. Zhao Yan smiled again. "Actually, everyone is fine. It's just that you can't let it go." He held the steering wheel with his long fingers and focused on driving, but his voice was unbelievably gentle. "It's been so many years. You've punished yourself enough. Don't live for others anymore." Qin Mu didn't say anything. She even held her breath and looked at him. Zhao Yan reached out and ruffled her hair. "Silly, whether you and Zhou Chongwang are together or not doesn't affect your brother and Cher. You can choose the path you want to take." He snorted. "For example, go to New York with me. I can play the piano for you for a long time." He said it very casually, but Qin Mu was stunned. She and Zhao Yan had always been friends, and she had never had that kind of thought. Now that he said it, she was shocked and surprised. She felt sorry for him because she really didn't have any other feelings. She didn't say anything. Zhao Yan smiled. "I'm joking with you." As for whether it was a joke or not, she didn't know, but she was relieved to be able to get out of this embarrassing situation. Zhao Yan said a few more words to tease her, and the atmosphere eased up. When the car stopped at the Qin family's house, Zhao Yan stopped the car and looked at Qin Mu. "It was just a joke." "Qin Mu, when Gu Zhe said this to you, what were your thoughts? Qin Mu looked at him in surprise, not knowing how he knew. Zhao Yin smiled. When you were at the beach with him, I was behind a rock. Qin Mu's face darkened. Only then did she know that Zhao Yin had been making fun of her today. She pinched him and got out of the car. Zhao Yin also got out, smiling. However, the two little ones soon stopped smiling because Zhou Chengwang was also at the Qin family's house. He was glaring at them as if there was grass growing on his hair. Zhao Yin smiled, opened the car door, got into the car and drove away. To be honest, that smile was quite provocative, at least in Zhou Chengwang's eyes. When the car drove away, his face was burning as he looked at Qin Mu. Can you explain? Explain what? Explain that I cheated on you? Qin Mu was in a bad mood, and she didn't take him seriously, so she didn't hold back. She even hit him with her bag. Zhou Chengwang was stunned for a moment. He then followed behind her and quickly grabbed her little hand. Qin Mu, speak clearly. Qin Mu stopped in his tracks and smiled calmly. All right, speak clearly. Let's go to the Civil Affairs Bureau and clarify things. What do you think, Director Zhou? Even if it's Zhong, I'm in a Zhong, a married woman. Qin Mu sneered. Even if it's a lie, it's me, an unmarried woman, who takes advantage of you. Zhou Chengwang was humiliated, but he still endured it. After all, this was the Qin family. He coughed lightly. Mumu, Mom and I made dumplings together. Do you want to eat some? I've eaten with Zhao Yin. She seemed to be deliberately angering him. She tried to break free, but Zhou Chengwang's grip was firm. His eyes were deep. Then eat with me. Chapter 2257. After she said that, Zhou Chengwang stopped in his tracks. Qin Mu, you also know that I pester you all day? She wanted to take a step back, but he pulled her forward again, almost sticking to his body. Do you think that I have nothing to do all day, so I'll wander around in front of you? You did it willingly. Qin Mu was not a naive girl. She was easily fooled by him and said unhappily. Zhou Chengwang reached out and pulled her into his arms. She raised her head and pressed it against his chin. Yes, I did it willingly, but Mrs. Zhou is always around Zhao Yin all day. Isn't that right? His eyes were quite stern. Qin Mu bit her lip. No. He glared at her fiercely. He confessed to you and is going to take you to New York, isn't he? Qin Mu did not say anything. She stared at Zhou Chengwang in a daze. How'd he guess it? She did not speak, but in his heart, she tacitly agreed. He couldn't help but be furious, but he suppressed his temper. We're not divorced yet. Qin Mu glanced at him. She found that he was angry, so she was happy. We will be divorced soon. She wanted to annoy him. Zhou Chengwang narrowed his eyes and looked at the ridiculous apron he was wearing. Because of her, he never appeared in any entertainment venues again. He threw all those small celebrities and models to the back of his mind. He followed her around every day and sucked up to his mother-in-law. What was it for? Probably because she saw his anger. Qin Mu's tone was very indifferent. Zhou Chengwang, what I did in the past was far better than what you did, but you still did not look at me. You played what you should and shouldn't play with. And I was just eating and chatting with a friend. It didn't bother you. After she said that, she pushed him away and walked to the main house. Zhou Chengwang was originally furious, but after carefully thinking about her words, it seemed like she was clarifying that there was nothing between her and Zhao Yin, so he couldn't help but lightly smile. Zhou Chengwang didn't know what was going on with him either. In short, ever since Qin Mu wanted to divorce him, there were a lot of peach blossoms around her. Forget about Gu Zhe. Even Zhao Zi said that he liked Qin Mu. There was also Zhao Yin. He always felt that this guy was always so free with Qin Mu. Who the hell did Zhao Yin attend the last reality show for? God knows. Zhou Zong thought about it and became angry again. He took off his apron and followed Qin Mu in. Qin Mu and Yu Liangqiu were sitting on the sofa. Zhou Chengwang could be insolent in front of anyone because he had fallen out with them in the past. However, Yu Liangqiu was the only one whom he had some respect for. Seeing that both mother and daughter were silent, he pursed his lips. I'll head to the dining room first then. He looked at Qin Mu, hinting that they would head home after they were done eating. Qin Mu ignored him and continued talking to her mother, talking about her brother and Cher. She could tell that for the past few years, other than her brother, there was her mother as well. Her mother had always been feeling guilty. Even if she didn't say it, Qinmu knew that her mother was longing for Cher to return. She longed for redemption. But this time around, her mother was going to be disappointed. Qinmu couldn't bear to hear that, so she told the truth. "Mummy, I bumped into Cher and that Lanyu in the dining room." Yi Liangxiu sighed out. "What sort of person is he?" Chapter 2258. He's from a good family. Yi Liangxiu forced a smile. "What about your brother? He's not going to fight with anyone, is he?" Everyone was surprised by Lan Yu's sudden change. After all, Yi Liangxiu had heard from Qinmu that Cher and Yi Muyun had a relationship. Yi Liangxiu didn't understand, and neither did Qinmu. The mother and daughter sat quietly for a long time. Yi Liangxiu patted the back of Qinmu's hand. "Go and eat some dumplings. Zhou Chengwang has been busy making them all morning." Qinmu didn't say anything. Yi Liangxiu said calmly, "If it's about the past, you don't have to. The important thing is whether you want to divorce him now or whether you want to live with him." "Mom," Qinmu couldn't help saying softly, "I haven't thought about it yet." Yi Liangxiu smiled faintly and patted her hand again. "Then think about it slowly. There's no rush to make a decision." She got up to eat the dumplings, and Qinmu accompanied her. When Zhou Chengwang was done, he attentively brought the dumplings over to Yi Liangxiu. He even specially used a small bowl to fill 4 dumplings for Qinmu. Qinmu didn't have enough for lunch, so she reluctantly ate a few dumplings. After eating, Yi Liangxiu sent the couple away, saying that she wanted to take a nap and couldn't accompany them. Zhou Chengwang naturally couldn't ask for more. Qinmu didn't want to disturb her mother, so she left with Zhou Chengwang. In the car, he tilted his head and asked her, "What are you thinking about? About your brother?" Qinmu was supporting her chin. Hearing his words, she quickly glanced at him. Zhou Chengwang saw that her eyes were a little red. He didn't say anything more and just ruffled her hair. Qinmu turned her face away and looked out of the car window. It wasn't until the car drove back to the house in Qingshui Road that Qinmu asked him in a low voice, "Zhou Chengwang, if my brother and the Tang family really reach that stage, will you help him or step on them and benefit from it?" Zhou Chengwang looked at her in surprise, as if he hadn't expected her to ask this. He smiled, slowly unbuckled his seatbelt, and said slowly, "My biggest benefit now is you, Qinmu. What do you want me to do?" Qinmu pursed her lips and said nothing. Zhou Chengwang's smile deepened. "You don't dare to say it? Are you afraid that I will make some improper requests?" Zhou Chengwang, that's enough." Qinmu bit her lips and glared at him. He pinched her chin. "You're my wife. I won't go too far." His voice was very soft and hoarse. "You know very well in your heart, don't you? As long as you stay by my side, I will unconditionally stand by your brother's side." With that, he opened the car door and got out of the car. Qinmu followed him all the way upstairs. She was a little absent-minded. When she came back to her senses, she had already followed him to the study upstairs. This was the first time Qinmu had come in. For a moment, she was a little stunned. His study was decorated very luxuriously. All the furniture was made of logs and pine, and there was a faint smell of wood. Qinmu wanted to leave, but he stopped her. "You can decide after reading this." Qinmu frowned. Zhou Chengwang walked to the desk, took out a document from the drawer, and gently put it on the table. Mumu, if you're willing to stay, this is yours." Qinmu looked suspicious, but she still took a step forward and gently picked up the document. She was stunned after looking at it. 8% of Boyi's shares. Chapter 2259. Qinmu knew that the market value of Glory Light was only 70 to 80 billion yuan. Seeing her surprised expression, Zhou Chengwang smiled. 8 years is enough for a person to do a lot of things. Qinmu's expression suddenly changed. She stared at Zhou Chengwang. "You've thought about Boyi before?" "Yes." Zhou Chengwang admitted it directly. "But now I think that your brother and I are very close, and it seems like a good idea to support him. What do you think, Mu?" Qinmu's voice was tense. "My brother may not go that far. He's already taken it." Zhou Chengwang's voice sounded a bit cold. You probably don't know this, but he already has 30% of the shares, and Tang Shui has 20%, but Zhao Yi has 15%. That is to say, Tang's share will still be the biggest shareholder, but if I help him, Boyi will change owners. This was a huge temptation for Qinmu. She didn't mean that she wanted her brother to get Boyi. She just felt that if getting Boyi could change Cher's mind, she was willing to do anything. Of course, she knew that 8% wouldn't be easy to get. She wanted it now. Zhou Chengwang looked at Qinmu. How could he not know what she was thinking? He had a faint smile on his face. Qinmu, think about it carefully. Is it worth it for Yimu Yun's unknown future? Qinmu's eyes were still on the document. She said softly, my brother gave up once for me. I can do it too. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the document and held it in her arms. At this moment, her heart was trembling and her whole body was trembling. She looked at him and finally said slowly, I want it now. Zhou Chengwang looked in her eyes and smiled. He took out another document from the drawer. I think if you sign this, we will probably have a better time working together. It was a marital agreement. Qinmu looked at it for a long time. She reached for it and read it page by page. At the end, she was a little surprised. The agreement was very simple and formulaic, but in the end, it was a handwritten guarantee from Zhou Chengwang. He guaranteed that he would play for Elise for Qinmu once a day. He guaranteed that it would be fresh every day. He guaranteed that he would wake her up with a kiss every day, and he guaranteed that he would have sex with her more than 4 times a week. Qinmu glared at him and continued reading. He promised to cook for Mumu every day. He promised that there would be no other women in the future. In the marriage between Zhou Chengwang and Qinmu, there would be only the two of them. There would not be a third party. Of course, if Qinmu cheated, he would kill the husband. At first, Qinmu was a little touched, but in the end, she shouted, What do you mean by Qinmu cheated? She squinted at him and said, Zhou Chengwang, do you mean that I will cheat on you? Zhou Chengwang held back his laughter and said, I mean if. He paused for a moment and looked at her meaningfully. Guze, don't tell me that no one knows that you sat by the sea that night. Qinmu snorted and ignored him. Zhou Chengwang walked around the desk, and hugged her from behind. His arms slowly tightened, and his hot face was buried in her neck. His voice was low and hoarse. Mumu, will you sign it? Chapter 2260. He sighed. I want you to sign it, but at the same time, I don't want you to sign it. Mumu, I hope you'll change your mind because you still love me and have confidence in me again, not because of this 8%, and I don't want you to feel that it's a sacrifice. Qinmu's voice was a little faint. Then won't you be able to get the truth if you give it to me for free? Zhou Chengwang chuckled and bit her neck to vent his anger. You're getting naughtier and naughtier. But I can't sign it now, okay? Qinmu bit her lip. I need to think about it. But he tightened his arms around her waist and said, Mumu, I want it now. Qinmu turned her face away and wanted to talk to him. But before she could speak, her mouth was blocked. Then she was carried to the desk, and he stood in the middle of her body and leaned forward to kiss her. The agreement in her hand fell to the ground with a thud, and she came back to her senses. Focus. He bit her lips and said unhappily, Mrs. Zhou. Qinmu struggled slightly. Zhou Chengwang, this is the study. She was not used to doing this, and she was not used to doing this kind of thing in such a place. Zhou Chengwang said in a low voice, Do it here. His tone was a little domineering and did not allow her to refuse. Qinmu resisted a little, but he was unable to resist. He was still pressed down on the desk and had another round of sex. When it ended, she lay in his arms and buried her face in his waist. She was crying because she had been bullied by him just now. Zhou Chengwang knew that he was a little rough. The way he had taken her just now was almost barbaric. He patted her shoulder and comforted her gently. Okay, don't cry. But the more he comforted her, the more Qinmu cried. She curled up in his arms like a little girl and cried miserably. Zhou Chengwang couldn't do anything to her, so he could only hug her and coax her. Qinmu hugged him with one arm and stretched out her hand. You signed the agreement. Zhou Chengwang didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He kissed her forehead in a low voice. Just one time with you, and tens of billions are gone? What should I do if you still divorce me? Because he hadn't left her yet. As he said this, he deliberately tormented her again. Qin Mu wailed. Her heart was trembling from his torture. She lay in his arms and hugged him tightly. Her voice was also soft. Zhou Chengwang, tell me, if you go away, what shall I do? He began again. Qin Mu was afraid of him. Moreover, he had just done it. How could his stamina be so good? Qin Mu couldn't stand it anymore. She bit her lips and said with a trembling voice, I'll sign, I'll sign. Although she said that, he still didn't let her go. He still burned her again. When Zhou Chengwang let go of her, Qin Mu felt that she was on the verge of death. She didn't know how she signed the agreement. She just wanted to sleep after signing it. Zhou Chengwang hugged her and whispered, Go take a shower before you sleep. Qin Mu tried hard to open one eye and said in a weak voice, No. She was afraid that he was going to do it again. But Zhou Chengwang smiled slightly. Mu, I don't think we've taken a bath together. She actually felt that he wanted to say something else. She wanted to resist, but she couldn't, so she let him carry her into the bathroom. Chapter 2261. He leaned against the bed. His body was exhausted, but he didn't feel like sleeping. He looked down at the young lady in his arms. She was indeed a young lady, only 22 years old. After 4 years of marriage, she wanted a divorce. Were they reconciled now? Although he had used some underhanded means. However, Zhou Chengwang didn't have anything to regret. After all, to him, fame and fortune had already been achieved. If he wanted to win Qin Mu's heart, he had to let go of his hatred. He chose to let go because he didn't want to lose Qin Mu. In the past, he wasn't too obsessed with revenge. However, what he had done for the past 8 years, he had never thought that he could get her back today. It was a little expensive, but it was worth it. Zhou Chengwang's eyes darkened. His large palm gently caressed her waist. There should already be a child here. He noticed that these few days were Qin Mu's period. He was working so hard, so there was no reason why she couldn't get pregnant. Although she had signed the agreement, he didn't know if they would fight in the future. There was no difference between a separation and a divorce. If his wife wasn't in his own bed, would she still be his wife? Therefore, to Zhou Chengwang, a child was safer than the agreement. Because Qin Mu was such a kind girl, she wouldn't let the child be without a father. He lay down for a while, then got up and went downstairs to prepare dinner for her. The servants weren't around, so he was the only one left. When Qin Mu woke up, it was already 10 o'clock. There was a bedside lamp in the bedroom, and the light was warm. She sat up and looked at herself under the blanket. There was only a bathrobe, which must have been changed by Zhou Chengwang. Footsteps could be heard on the stairs. Qin Mu burrowed into the blanket and buried her face. Soon, Zhou Chengwang appeared at the door. She rested her little face on her knees and looked at him carefully. She was a little stubborn and didn't make a sound. Are you angry? Zhou Chengwang smiled warmly. He walked over to sit by the bed and reached out to stroke her hair. I've made dinner. Shall I carry you downstairs to eat? Qin Mu didn't say anything and just looked at him. I promise that the 8% will be under your name tomorrow, okay? His palm landed and pinched her chin. Be good and eat. Qin Mu looked at him and felt that he was a stranger. After all, he had treated her coldly for 8 years. Now, she was a little absent-minded, so this was how it felt to be pampered. But she wasn't sure she liked it. At least, she couldn't let it go. Those injuries, those women, did not disappear from his memory just like that. Qin Mu bit her lips and kept looking at him. She didn't even know how cute she was. Zhou Chengwang reached out to rub her hair and smiled. Okay, I'll carry you downstairs. As he spoke, he dragged her out from under the blanket. Qin Mu whimpered, It hurts. He was stunned for a moment. Then, he saw the marks on her body. His eyes darkened as he asked softly, Does it still hurt? Afraid that she would fall, Qin Mu hooked her arms around his neck and refused to look at him. She only nodded her head. Zhou Chengwang smiled and kissed her. I won't be so rough in the future. Qin Mu bit her lips and glared at him. But she didn't say anything in the end. Although there were only the two of them, Zhou Chengwang still made a table full of dishes. Qin Mu looked at the time and guessed that he hadn't slept yet. After sitting down, she said softly, Too much. Chapter 2262. Zhou Chengwang's voice carried a hint of a smile. I'm afraid that I'm not good enough. After so many years, he didn't even know what she liked to eat. Hence, he cooked more, and there would always be dishes that she liked to eat. Qin Mu didn't know what he was thinking, but she was indeed hungry and tasted everything. He kept looking at her with a calm gaze. The meal was eaten in silence. After all, they weren't as intimate as an ordinary husband and wife, and there was always something between them. Zhou Chengwang didn't force her. Anyway, they had a generation of time, and they could take it slowly. After the meal, Zhou Chengwang was the one who cleaned up and washed the dishes. After washing, Qin Mu sat on the sofa and said softly, "You don't have to do this for me. Let the servants at home go to work tomorrow." Zhou Chengwang smiled faintly. "But I gave them 3 days off." Qin Mu looked at him for a long time, indicating that he was quite bored. Zhou Chengwang suddenly came over, reached out and carried her, and walked toward the piano by the floor-to-ceiling window. Qin Mu struggled instinctively. "Zhou Chengwang, what do you want to do?" "Let go." He placed her beside him. Qin Mu was really afraid of him, and she pursed her lips. "What do you want to do?" "Play the piano and make love." "You go first." He smiled, and it was a very hateful smile. Qin Mu glared at him. "You're not going to choose?" "If you're not going to choose, I'll choose." Zhou Chengwang pinched her nose. "You know which one I'll choose. Play the piano." Qin Mu's voice was very fast. Zhou Chengwang chuckled and played a song according to her wishes. It was something Qin Mu had never heard before. It was quite beautiful. After he finished playing, she tilted her head and asked him, "Why haven't I heard it before?" Zhou Chengwang put down his hands and turned his face to look at her seriously. Then, he cupped her face with both hands and kissed her. His voice was especially deep. "This is a song I wrote for you. I haven't thought of a name yet. How about calling it Annie Baby?" Qin Mu's eyes fell on his face. After a while, she said, "You can compose songs?" "Yes, but usually not." He smiled. "Do you want to hear it again?" Qin Mu leaned her head on his shoulder and said, "Go ahead." However, Qin Mu did not start immediately. Instead, she chased after her and kissed her lightly on the lips. She murmured, "Mu Mu, I hope that one day you will be with me, not because of your brother's sacrifice. If you support him unconditionally now, it won't be a sacrifice for me." She smiled slightly. "Zhou Chengwang, do you dare?" Her smile was so bright and lively. It was something he had rarely seen. In the past, he had never thought that his wife was boring. She was clearly very interesting. Zhou Chengwang did not answer. Instead, he kissed her lips. After a long time, he said in a low voice, "Mu Mu, I don't dare." Because he did not dare to waste the last chance. If she ran away, there was nothing he could do about her. He did not let go of her. Instead, he pressed his forehead against hers and kissed her over and over again until her toes curled up. Zhou Chengwang was indulgent. Probably because she had been cold to him for too long, he did not let her go all night. In the past, this kind of thing between them was the traditional kind. Now, he suddenly let go, and Qin Mu could not bear it. Chapter 2263. At this time, B City was shrouded in smoke. Boyi was changing. The entire upper class of B City knew that Yi Muyun was going to force the Empress to abdicate. Boyi was divided into 2 groups. One group had no support. After all, Tang Yu was playing abroad and didn't want to go home, and Cher didn't want to make progress and wasn't cut out for business at all. The other group was Yi Muyun's loyal subordinates. But these people weren't the most important. The most important ones were the shareholders of Boyi. From the looks of it, Tang's share had the upper hand in the shares, but she wasn't good at managing. Before she found someone who could replace Mr. Yi, Miss Tang had to listen to Yi Muyun on many things. Just when a storm was brewing, a stack of photos smeared a layer of ambiguity on the upper class. In fact, it wasn't embarrassing because the male and female lead were married. To put it bluntly, they were husband and wife. But at the same time, the female lead was also the female lead in the drama of forcing the Empress to abdicate. This couldn't help but make people think too much. This time, was it Tang Sher's counterattack? One had to know that Mr. Yi loved Miss Tang to death. This time, Miss Tang couldn't fight him openly, so it was possible that she would use her feelings as a weapon in secret. The photos taken by Lan Yu, because he accidentally lost his phone when he went to the bathroom to eat in the restaurant. The photos of Cher that were taken by his phone made the entertainment headlines and caused a sensation for 3 consecutive days. Those photos weren't just of her, but also of her and Lan Yu. On the top floor of the Boyi office building, Yi Muyun was holding a newspaper in his hand and standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling window. He wore a pair of iron gray trousers with a dark blue shirt on top. He looked like a well-ironed elite. Behind him, Guze stood quietly with a solemn expression on his face. After a long time, he couldn't help but say quietly, "Mr. Yi, it can't be Cher. She has no reason to do this." Guze clearly remembered the press conference that day. When Lan Yu appeared, Cher looked at Mr. Yi cautiously, like a child who had done something wrong. At that time, he couldn't bear to watch. The newspaper was torn into pieces between Yi Muyun's fingers, and the pieces fell to the ground one by one. It was a frightening sight. Yi Muyun suppressed his voice. Guze, she won't. But that guy called Lan Yu would. This was a provocation from Lan Yu. Yi Muyun turned his head slowly. Do you think Lan Yu loves her? If he loved someone, would he expose that person's body in front of the whole world like that? Although she was wearing a shirt, it was a man's deep-rooted bad habit to not want others to see his woman's body at all. Moreover, it was a bed photo like this. Guze was silent for a while. He looked at Yi Muyun calmly. Mr. Yi, what about our plan? Continue with it. Yi Muyun turned his back and looked at the scenery outside. He said calmly, She's so silly. She needs someone to protect her. Even if it was a little intense, he still wanted to protect her for the rest of her life. Even if she was by someone else's side. These few days, he had been thinking that if they didn't have a child, would he impulsively tie her back to his side? Even if he had to make the whole world his enemy, he would force her to stay. But she and Lan Yu had a child, such an adorable child. When Yi Muyun said this, his voice sounded very tired. Guze sighed softly, but he didn't say anything else. Before he left, all he could think about was that in this lifetime, Chairman Yi had lived entirely for Tang Shui. Chapter 2264. As the office door closed, Guze bumped into Secretary Zheng Sini at the door. She was holding a cup of coffee and looked like she was about to go in. Guze paused and smiled faintly. Secretary Zheng, the CEO is not in a good mood right now. It's better if you don't go in. Zheng Sini looked up and met Guze's deep gaze. She smiled faintly and said, I think Mr. Yi needs a cup of coffee right now. It's useless. Guze's tone became even more indifferent. All these years, do you know how many women who are younger and prettier than you are? Do you know how many of them have thrown themselves into Mr. Yi's arms? But Mr. Yi has never accepted them. Zheng Sini looked embarrassed that she had been exposed, but she quickly retorted, That's because Mr. Yi hasn't given up yet. Now that Tang Cher has a husband and child, does Mr. Yi still need to keep his chastity for her? Guze listened to her words and looked at her meaningfully. He simply said, You seem to be smarter than Song Karen. In fact, she was even dumber. Why could Song Karen become Mr. Yi's temporary girlfriend? It was because Song Karen was the same age as Cher, and her face somewhat resembled Cher. Did Zheng Sini not realize all this? Or perhaps she was pretending not to understand. Guze didn't say anything else and quickly left, leaving Secretary Zheng standing outside the office with a cup of coffee in her hand. She was a little hesitant, but she didn't hesitate for too long. She pushed the door open and said with a decent smile, Mr. Yi, get out. Yi Muyun wasn't as gentle to her as he was to Guze. His attitude was unusually rude. The smile on Zheng Sini's face froze. She thought that no matter how indifferent he was to her, she was still an outstanding secretary, and he would give her the respect she deserved. But at this moment, she was shocked by his brutality. He was no longer that noble young master, but an ordinary man trapped by love. Zheng Sini's eyes were brimming with tears. She revealed the fragility of a woman at the right time. Mr. Yi, you're the secretary. If you're not my personal relationship consultant, you can either resign or apply for a transfer. Do it today. Yi Muyun sounded a little impatient. Zheng Sini gasped. She could barely hold the cup of coffee in her hand. After a long while, she bit her lip and asked softly, "Is it true that other than Tang Sher, no one else has a place in your heart?" Originally, he didn't want to answer her question, but Yi Muyun still answered, "Yes." "Why?" Zheng Sini seemed to be insulted and finally couldn't help getting excited. "She's married. Didn't you see those photos?" What she didn't say was that his woman had slept with someone else. When he missed her, she was lying under someone else's body, tossing and turning. Her excitement didn't bring her any substantial benefits. She was dismissed. Yi Muyun finally turned his head slowly and looked at Zheng Sini quietly. It was the first time in all these years that he looked at her so carefully. Without the naivety of her school days, she was undoubtedly beautiful. It was this beauty that gave her the confidence to think that he would fall in love with her over time. Yi Muyun's gaze was deep. Zheng Sini's heart skipped a beat. She felt uneasy and even more nervous. Chapter 2265. She firmly believed that after Tang Sher got married, had a husband and children, any smart man would give up on Tang Sher. After all, with Mr. Ye's status, it was impossible for him to accept a divorced woman. But after a few seconds, Yi Muyun slowly walked to the desk, pressed the intercom, and said in an indifferent tone, "Get the people from the HR department and the security guards here." Zheng Sini was stunned for a moment, and then she took a step back. "Mr. Yi, I was wrong." Yi Muyun didn't speak. He just took out a cigarette and lit it with a lighter. In the blue flame, Zheng Sini clearly saw his eyes, which were deep and cold. This gaze made Zheng Sini understand that he would never accept her. The security guards came quickly, and the manager of the HR department quickly understood the situation. When he looked at Zheng Sini, his expression was a little disdainful. Another woman who overestimated herself. Was Mr. Yi such a casual man? What gave her the confidence to think that now that there was a change in Boyi, Mr. Yi and Miss would be finished? No one could tell what would happen tomorrow until the end of the story. Zheng Sini left Boyi. Before she left, Yi Muyun suddenly said in an indifferent tone, "Do you know why I kept you alive until now?" Zheng Sini didn't say anything. "What you did for Zhou Chengwang was enough to put you in jail for a few years, but now there's no need for that. Take care of yourself." Yi Muyun's tone was very indifferent as he gave her the final answer. Zheng Sini was stunned. She had never thought that he knew about it. But after all these years, why didn't he expose her? As if he knew what she was thinking, Yi Muyun's voice was indifferent. "Because you are her past. I just keep her past by her side, and she will be angry." Zheng Sini took a deep breath. It was just like that. So it was just like that. She used to work for Zhou Chengwang, but later on, her feelings for Zhou Chengwang faded. He was no longer the piano prince that she liked. Her eyes began to involuntarily chase after Yi Muyun. Compared to Zhou Chengwang, Yi Muyun was more loyal. She liked his steadfastness, but she also hated it. Just like now, she had lost to his steadfastness. She had not lost to Tang Xue, but to Yi Muyun. Her love was not worth mentioning in front of him. If she said it now, she would only be humiliating herself. Zheng Sini left with her remaining pride, but when no one was around, it shattered into pieces. However, no one cared about this. Standing in front of the Boyi building, Zheng Sini understood one thing. She would never become the heroine of those outstanding men, because she was ordinary to begin with. In the top-floor office of the Boyi building, Yi Muyun was still standing alone. Guze knocked on the door and entered. "Mr. Yi, we've tried our best to recall all the printed publications. We've also cleared the mainstream media on the internet, but we can't do anything about those that have been downloaded." Yi Muyun nodded. "Thank you for your hard work." He turned around slowly and looked at Guze. "How is she?" At this moment, he didn't care about the changes in the Boyi building. He only cared about how she was. Would she be angry after seeing these photos? Guze hesitated for a moment. "These 2 days, Cher has been staying in the hotel and hasn't gone out. The photos must have affected her, but I found out something." Chapter 2266. Finally, Guze said, "Lanyu has a female assistant who has been with him for about 10 years. I heard that they were university classmates." That woman followed Lan Yu the moment they graduated. That woman came to be city these past 2 days. Just this morning, she arranged to meet Cher. As for what they talked about, because it was a private room, I have no way of knowing. What about Lan Yu? Does he know? Yi Muyun asked. Guze said mildly, he probably doesn't know. Because after Yang Yani met, she immediately took the earliest flight back to New York. She should be on the plane now. Yi Muyun nodded. Get someone to follow her and bring her here if necessary. I have something to ask her. Guze grunted and left. Cher walked into the study of the hotel suite. She looked at Lan Yu, pursed her lips, and asked softly, why did you do that? Lan Yu was on the phone. He was probably talking to his personal assistant, Yang Yani, in New York. After hearing Cher's words, he turned his head and said to Yang Yani calmly, I'll call back later. With that, he hung up. Cher looked at her brand new phone and tilted her head. Don't tell me you lost your phone. Yes, I lost it, Lan Yu said calmly. Because of those photos? Cher pursed her lips. I want to ask, why do you have those photos? Why did they fall into the hands of the reporters? Lan Yu's lips curled into a smile. Cher, you really don't know why? He took a step forward, while Cher took 2 steps back. Her face was filled with distrust. Lan Yu's gaze was deep, his thin lips slowly spitting out a few words. Because I care. So you took those photos on purpose to hurt him? Really? Cher's eyes were filled with suspicion. Lan Yu, what are you doing? Our marriage is fake. We didn't even register it. We only have a marriage certificate that can fool Ishu. Don't tell me you want to turn this fake marriage into reality? Cher pursed her lips. You know I can leave any time, and I don't even need to be restrained. Lan Yu's face was filled with anger. I can make that piece of paper real at any time. I missed a number on the passport, Cher said quickly, successfully making Lan Yu's expression change. He had never expected Tang Shui, to be so scheming. At that time, she was clearly on the verge of death. She signed whatever he asked her to sign. Towards the benefactor who saved her life, she was almost obedient. Unexpectedly, she still had this last trick up her sleeve. Do you know why I was able to fool them so easily? Snow's voice was very soft. Lan Yu frowned and looked at her. Because of Yang Yani. Cher's voice was cold. I didn't know what kind of relationship you had with her at first. I always thought you were pure until I saw this. There was a phone in Cher's hand. You were too careless. Lan Yu's expression changed. In this, apart from the photos you took from me, there are also photos of you and Yang Yani. Cher said clearly, you and her are in a relationship. So, there was a mistake in their marriage certificate when it was passed through Yang Yani's hands. Such a low-level mistake would never happen in the hands of a professional secretary. Chapter 2267. After Cher said that, Lan Yu's expression turned extremely ugly. He still stood there and smiled faintly. Yes, we were once in a relationship, but after we got married, I didn't touch her again. We were never married. Cher scoffed coldly. Lan Yu, don't lie to yourself. Cher raised her hand and threw a stack of photos at Lan Yu's face. This is the answer, and also your plot to get close to me, isn't it? Those photos were like snowflakes falling on Lan Yu's face, tearing their faces apart. Living together for 5 years wasn't enough to make up for the one time he had hurt Yi Muyun. Lan Yu didn't know why, but he felt sad. It wasn't for Lan Ting, but for himself. He lowered his head and looked at the photos at his feet, smiling faintly. All these years mean nothing to you, right? Cher pursed her lips and said stubbornly, yes. However, there were tears in her eyes. For 5 years, she had always treated him like a brother, like a teacher. But he had a motive for getting close to her. It was because of his sister. 10 years ago, when Yi Muyun was studying abroad in New York, your sister, Lan Ting, was crazy about him. But after failing to pursue him, she jumped off a building. Cher's voice was indifferent, but it also cruelly dug out the hurt in Lan Yu's heart. So, you thought that the best way to take revenge on him was to make it so that we could never be together. You married me, but you couldn't accept being with me, so you used many methods. Cher looked at him and asked slowly, what about Ishu? Is he your and Yang Yani's child? Is it fair to him to do this? Lan Yu's lips curled up coldly. There's nothing unfair to him. He's my son. Cher closed her eyes slightly. I'll take him away. Leave? Lanyu went forward, held her shoulders, and narrowed his eyes. Where do you want to go? Take Ishu back to New York. Cher broke free from him. You're crazy. I can't let Ishu be with you. Ishu was such a cute child. She didn't want him to live in a world full of hatred. But just as she struggled free, Lanyu grabbed her hand again. His face was full of anger. What about my sister? Did she die for nothing? You're so stubborn. You clearly know that she's taking things too hard for herself. It has nothing to do with Yi Muyun. Cher pursed her lips and looked at Lanyu. Both of you are sick. Just as she finished speaking, her body was folded into his embrace. His arms were like steel, locking her in place. He said in a low voice, Since you already know everything, I don't mind telling you some more things. Cher was stunned. All that was left on Lanyu's face was gloomy and filled with hatred. This was far beyond what Cher had imagined. Lanyu had always been a gentleman with a melancholic temperament, but now his face was filled with hostility. Do you know about Zhou Chengwan's father? Lanyu lowered his head and moved closer to her ear. That wasn't a coincidence. It was a deliberate arrangement. Cher's eyes widened in shock. She didn't know that from that moment on, Lanyu had already seeped into her life. He was too scary. Chapter 2268. Cher's body was trembling. What do you want to do? If I destroy you, do you think he will still want you? Lanyu's voice was low and hoarse. I heard that he almost went crazy just by looking at those photos. Cher narrowed her eyes and raised her hand. She slapped Lanyu hard. You're crazy. He took the slap and didn't fight back. He just held her in his arms and kissed her fiercely. Cher was scared out of her wits. She tried her best to move her face away from him, but he always had a way of finding her. In the end, he bit down on her neck with such force that it was as if he was going to swallow her whole. Cher kicked and hit him, but he didn't let go. Bright red blood flowed down from her little neck, dripping down bit by bit. She looked like a small animal on the verge of death. She knew that if Lanyu didn't let her go, she wouldn't be able to escape. She pinched his arm and said hoarsely, Lanyu, is it worth it to sacrifice your whole life for someone who has already left? Lanyu finally let go. He looked at the blood on her fair skin, and his eyes darkened. Is it worth it? She's also my sister. Cher touched her neck and looked at Lanyu. She got straight to the point. The person you like is your sister. Lanyu's face changed. For so many years, that kind of shameful taboo and the anger of being exposed. The look in his eyes became terrifying. When Cher wanted to escape, he pulled her into his arms from behind. I want you now. I should have done it long ago. He whispered in her ear. This way, you can't escape anymore. Cher was stunned for a moment and screamed. No, let go of me. Lanyu, pervert. She had a deep fear. If Yang Yani hadn't deliberately exposed her, she didn't know how long she would have hurt Yi Muyun. And their separation was all because of Lanyu. She had even lived by Lanyu's side for so long. Cher bit her lips and didn't let him succeed. However, Lanyu's fingers pinched her chin. She was in pain and was forced to open her lips at that moment. Cher was extremely embarrassed and angry. Her eyes stared at Lanyu like a stranger. Moreover, it was filled with disgust. Lanyu suddenly couldn't stand this kind of gaze. He narrowed his eyes and said, I will make you do it willingly. With that, he dragged her into the study room with one hand and took out a pill with the other, stuffing it into her mouth. Shweh. Turned her face away, refusing to eat, but he pressed her down and forced her to swallow it. It melted in her mouth and was very sweet. However, Cher immediately guessed what it was. There was fear in her eyes. She thought she knew what he wanted to do. Lanyu's face was no longer gentle. What was left was only a twisted expression of revenge. He dragged her into his bedroom, turned on the infrared camera, and turned on the lights in the bedroom. He threw her onto the bed and stood at the end of the bed, looking at her from above. There was a faint light in his eyes. Since you already know, there's no need to hide. He bent down and bit her lips. Now, let's start a new relationship, okay? Cher looked at him in horror. She bit her lips so hard that it almost bled. Chapter 2269. She widened her eyes and watched as he inched towards her step by step. Just as he was about to kiss her lips, a timid voice came from the door. "Daddy." There was a tinge of timidity and fear in that soft voice. Lan Yu's body, which was already in a frenzy, suddenly cooled down. He turned his head and looked at the door. Xiao Yishu stood by the door. She was wearing a set of lamb pajamas and looked especially adorable. There was a puzzled look on his little face. He did not understand why Daddy was pressing down on Mommy and why Mommy was crying. Although there were scenes of adults kissing on TV, it was obvious that Daddy and Mommy were different. The little boy stood at the door, and his big eyes were filled with tears. However, the little lamb was a little man and did not cry. If he were to cry, Mommy would definitely cry even harder. No matter how angry Lan Yu was, his heart softened a little as he looked at Xiao Yishu. He rolled to the side and calmed himself down before turning to look at Cher. He said in a hoarse voice, "I'll get the doctor here." The medicine was quite strong. If there was no man, she would have to get an injection. Cher closed her eyes and tried her best not to hug him. She did not want to lose her composure in front of Xiao Yishu. Lan Yu sat up and smiled at Xiao Yishu. "Mommy is sick. Daddy, get the doctor here." "Really?" The little boy ran over and half knelt beside Cher. He reached out to touch her forehead and said in a childish voice, "Mommy, don't cry. You'll be fine after the doctor gives you an injection." Then she felt a soft little boy in her arms. There was a milky scent on his body. It was a scent that she was familiar with. It was her salvation. Lan Yu leaned against the headboard, and his eyes fell on the mother and son. He called the Lan family doctor over in a calm tone. Cher suppressed her voice and said, "Just get the hotel doctor." He pressed a hand on her shoulder and smiled. "Do you think I'll let Yun know what happened between us? Do you think we can still live in harmony like before?" Cher clenched her teeth, closed her eyes, and pressed Xiao Yishu into her arms. No matter how ignorant Xiao Yishu was, she knew that her parents were quarreling, and the problem was serious. The little guy bit his lip, then hugged Lan Yu and burst into tears. "Daddy, don't bully Mommy." Lan Yu had a little thing in his arms. After all, he was the one who brought her up, so his heart softened a little. He was about to say something, but Cher had already turned over from the side of the bed and fled toward the door. Lan Yu was shocked. She had been fed that drug, and it would be very dangerous for her to go out now. There was a high chance that she had found a man to sleep with. He couldn't care less. He pushed Xiao Yishu aside and chased after her. But this push caused Xiao Yishu's forehead to hit the corner of the bed, and a trace of blood flowed out. It was clearly a small wound, but the blood kept flowing like a thin line of water. Lan Yu cursed. At this moment, Xiao Yishu's life and Cher's chastity were placed together. He chose his son's life. He knew that she would come back. For Yishu, she would come back. Moreover, those photos had already cut off her escape route. Chapter 2270. Xiao Yishu was still crying softly. Lan Yu comforted him gently, then carried him out and drove to the hospital. Xiao Yishu had a special constitution. It was difficult to stop bleeding once he touched it. Moreover, he had H-negative blood, and Lan Yu happened to have H-negative blood as well. It seemed that it was God's arrangement. Xiao Yishu should be Lan Yu's son. At this time, Lan Yu had no other choice. Yishu was in trouble. Everything he had was gone. As Lan Yu drove, this thought popped up in his mind, and he asked himself, what's going on? What did he have all these years? Was he already reluctant to part with it? Reluctant to part with this seemingly warm family? Did he take it seriously? Was it because he had been acting for too long and was too immersed in it? His feelings were complicated. He was worried about Cher's drug. He wanted to make a call, but she must not have brought her phone when she went out like that. In the end, he called the hotel manager on duty and told her that his wife had drunk a little. He asked them to help look for her, and he was taking his son to the hospital. No one dared to neglect Mrs. Lan. They couldn't find her, so they turned on the surveillance cameras to look for her. In the end, they confirmed that Cher was sitting at the door of the suite on the top floor. She was very thin. The manager on duty heaved a sigh of relief. Just as he was about to call Lan Yu, a friend beside him bit her finger. "Miss Tang doesn't look right. Are you sure you want to call Lan Yu and not Mr. Yi?" The manager on duty pursed his lips. In the end, he changed his mind and called Yi Muyun. His words were the same as Lan Yu's. He said that Tang Yishu had drunk too much and was now at the door of the presidential suite on the top floor. Yi Muyun arrived in 5 minutes. He happened to pass by here just now. Guze was also with him. When the elevator on the top floor opened, Yi Muyun looked at Cher and raised his hand, signaling Guze not to follow him. He could tell that something was wrong with Cher just by looking at her eyes. "Should I call a doctor?" Guze asked softly. He could also see that not only her eyes, but the skin on her body was also flushed. He could tell at a glance that she had taken some medicine. The manager on duty came from the other side and said in a low voice, "Mr. Yi." Mr. Lan said he took his son to the hospital. Yi Muyun narrowed his eyes and said to Guze, "Go check it out." Guze nodded and gestured for the manager to follow him. The manager didn't know what to say and asked, "Don't you want to call the doctor?" Guze wanted to curse. Didn't he see that Cher didn't need a doctor? She needed his man. Chairman Yi was his mother's man. The manager was scared by Vice President Gu's sharp eyes. He shrank back and immediately followed him into the elevator. Guze looked at him and said coldly, "Do you know the consequences if you say a word about what happened today?" After all, Tang Cher was married now. It would be very disadvantageous if she and Mr. Yi got into trouble. The manager swallowed hard and immediately nodded to show that he understood. What else could he not understand? What he wanted was that Mr. Yi wanted to sleep with Miss Gu. Miss Gu was married, but Mr. Yi had to give the antidote himself. She had a husband, and she could find a doctor. Mr. Yi didn't need to do this kind of thing in person. If he did it, it could only mean one thing. Mr. Yi wanted it himself. Chapter 2271. At the entrance of the presidential suite, Yi Muyun was stunned when he reached out and touched Cher. She was burning hot. Her entire body was burning hot. He narrowed his eyes. What did she eat? Who fed her the medicine? Was it Lan Yu? Yi Muyun reached out to pick her up and kicked open the door of the suite. She had been curled up in his arms and had not struggled at all. Her body was burning hot, but her mind was wandering. She gritted her teeth and endured it. She was hot and cold at the same time. She only knew that she was in Yi Muyun's arms, and she felt very safe. At that moment, she didn't want to think about anything else. She just wanted to stay with him quietly for a while. The past, the separation, Lan Yu, Zhou Chongguang, and Qin Mu were all gone. In this suite, there were only the two of them, her and her brother. Cher suddenly opened her eyes and looked at him with watery eyes. Her voice had a tinge of impatience, like a kitten in the village, teasing him without knowing it. "Brother." Yi Muyun's voice was as deep as water. He replied and placed her on the spacious sofa. She leaned on his knees and started kissing his chin, his cheeks, just like a little baby beast. There was a fire in his arms. He wanted her, but he still cared. It would be a lie to say that he didn't care. He cared that she belonged to someone else in the past, and he cared that she still belonged to someone else now. "Tell me, who fed you the medicine?" He pressed his forehead against hers and asked her in a low voice. Her eyes were misty and wide open. She shook her head. No one. Her entire body was in pain, but her mind was clear. She knew what it would mean if she told him. It would mean that she would lose Yishu, and it would mean that there would be a bloodbath in Beast City. She had fallen out with Lan Yu, but for the sake of Yishu, she knew that it would not come to that. However, her heart was also sad. Between her and Yishu, or between revenge and Yishu, Lan Yu had chosen Yishu, and she had also chosen Yishu among the hatred. After going through so many ugly things, she was unwilling to give up on that little person. Even if he was Lan Yishu's son, in Cher's heart, he was her own child. Her body was very hot, but she was crying. She didn't know how many times she begged him. She didn't know how cold his eyes were when he looked at her. However, when he kissed her, his clothes fell off one by one. His trousers, shirt, and her remaining clothes were thrown on the floor, piled together, looking extremely intimate. The effects of her drug were extremely long-lasting. He used the entire night to calm the restlessness in her body. When she woke up, he was still there. He was already dressed, looking impeccably dressed. He was standing at the head of the bed, looking at her with a deep gaze. Cher's body froze for a moment. Instinctively, she pulled the blanket higher and pursed her lips. Isn't it too late to block yourself now? Mrs. Lon. His tone was a little mocking. Then he walked towards the living room and said as he walked, "We can talk." Talk? She didn't understand. What did they talk about? Could it be Boy or their relationship? She felt a little guilty. No matter what, she was the one who used him last night. She knew the limits of a man's stamina, and they seemed to have done it no less than 5 times last night, and each time it took about an hour. He woke up early in the morning. Was there anything wrong with his body? Chapter 2272. She let her imagination run wild, but she didn't forget that Ishu was in the hospital now. When she escaped, Lan Yu pushed Ishu. She remembered that Lan Yu didn't chase after her, so he must have taken Ishu to the hospital. Pursing her lips, she lifted the blanket and got out of bed. When she landed, the corner of her mouth was twisted because it was too painful. Actually, by the end of last night, the effects of the drug had already worn off. It was completely a one-sided demand from him. She was in great pain, but he didn't stop. It seemed like he was punishing her, but more like he was punishing himself. Cher's heart was a little gloomy. He probably didn't want to go to bed with her. After all, she was a married woman. She didn't know how to tell him what she knew. Could she tell him that because a girl jumped off a building for him, Lan Yu took revenge on her, causing them to be separated all these years? She wouldn't pretentiously think that it was Yi Muyun's fault. It was her fault. She wasn't ruthless enough. Just Ishu alone was enough to hold her back. Yang Yani wanted her to find the answer herself, but she didn't know how to find it. Was there any secret about Lan Yu that she didn't know? Before Yang Yani left, she said something meaningful, and the truth is right beside you. When you find it, you can get rid of Lan Yu. Trust me, before that, don't leave him easily, or you will lose the most precious thing in your life. She didn't like Yang Yani, but she was always afraid of what that woman said. She put on a shirt absent-mindedly, didn't realize it was his, and went straight to the living room. Breakfast had already been delivered. Yi Muyun stood by the window and said calmly, "Go to the hospital later to see your son." Cher's body trembled. "Are you surprised?" He turned to look at her, his expression depressed. "Mrs. Lon, I really want to know if you thought about your husband when you were in my arms last night." "Huh?" Cher covered her face with her hands and chuckled softly. She knew that he didn't sleep for nothing. This revolt was just the beginning. "You can call a doctor," she said softly, but he was still suppressing it. "Yes, I can call a doctor. But what about you, Tang Cher? Can you call a doctor too? Instead of waiting for me at the entrance of the suite where we once spent our engagement night, you knew that the hotel staff could find you. So you were waiting for me here, waiting for me to come to you, right?" He even approached her slowly and pinched her chin, forcing her to look up at him. His deep gaze searched her little face. "Does Lan Yu know that you slept with your ex again?" As her little face paled, he smiled again. "He probably doesn't know how many times we did it on the Yunnan trip. When he had sex with you, didn't he feel that his wife's body was different? Don't you feel like you've done it with someone else?" He whispered into her ear. Cher's face turned pale, and she couldn't say a word. At this moment, even if she said that she didn't have sex with Lan Yu, he wouldn't believe her. The photos that Lan Yu posted online, she chuckled. He was really good. He had cut off her escape route. He had taken advantage of man's psychology and posted those photos. Any man would mind, but she didn't understand. "Does Mr. Yi think I'm dirty?" Cher raised her little face. "He thinks I'm dirty, but he still slept with me?" Chapter 2273. Is that so? But I think that Mr. Yi seems to be enjoying it. She was infuriated and argued with him. Yi Muyun tightened her grip on her chin. When her face turned pale, Yi Muyun suddenly let go of her and faintly smiled with a hint of mockery. "Yes, I enjoyed it. After all, Mrs. Zhou is very beautiful." Cher was furious. She reached out and wanted to slap him, but her arm was caught in mid-air. He lowered his head and looked at her with a burning gaze. "Why? You're not going to admit it now that you've enjoyed it, huh?" Letting go of her, Cher took 2 steps back and continued to glare at him. However, she didn't want to argue with him. She was very hungry. She hadn't eaten for the whole day. She sat at the dining table and ate slowly. She was very quiet. It wasn't like her in the past. Yoon just looked at her. He thought about how she used to look at him dozens of times when she ate. She would tell him, "Brother, I don't want to eat this. Brother, I don't want to eat that." He still remembered that last night, when she was at her weakest, she had hugged his neck and called a brother. He just stood there and looked at her with a deep gaze. "Tang Cher, do you love him?" Cher's hand that was holding the fork trembled. She looked up at him. Then she looked down and asked softly, "Is he very important to you?" Yoon snorted softly. "What do you think?" Cher's heart thumped twice, but she calmed herself down. She smiled faintly and imitated him. "What do you think?" His expression didn't look too good as he glared at her. Snow ate very quickly, probably because she was really in a hurry. After she finished eating, she stood up and looked at him. "Can you send me to hospital? Aren't you afraid that Lon will find out about us having sex?" Yoon calmly took out a cigarette and put it on his lips. He lit it and took a puff. Cher wiped her lips and walked towards the changing room. "It's already happened. Is Mr. Yi still shy?" She stood at the entrance of the changing room, a small flame burning in her eyes. "Mr. Yi, did you not think it through before you did it with me? I'm just anxious to see you." His gaze deepened as he said slowly. Cher's face turned red, then white, then red. Finally, she didn't say anything and went inside to change her clothes. When she came out, she found that Yoon had also put on his coat and was holding the car keys in his hand. When they got into the car, his voice was very calm. "You don't look like a particularly anxious mother." Cher buckled her seatbelt and looked up at him. "Yoon, if it were you, do you think you would immediately go to see your own child with a messy appearance after having sex with an extramarital man?" Yoon's fingers, which had been holding the steering wheel, suddenly moved to her lips. He sneered. "Mrs. Lon, you seem to be used to secretly eating." Cher turned her little face away. "It's none of your business." He pinched her little chin, and his gaze was burning. She couldn't stand his scrutinizing gaze. "Yoon, if you don't want to send me, I can go to the hospital myself." He chuckled, let go of his hand, and started the car. Along the way, the two of them didn't say a word. They each had their own thoughts. When they arrived at the hospital, he stopped the car. Cher unbuckled her seatbelt and said calmly, "Thank you. Goodbye." "Are you thanking me for sending you here, or thanking me for satisfying you for one night, Mrs. Lon?" His voice was still mocking. Chapter 2274. "Is this all you've got?" There was a hint of mockery in his voice. "Or is Lon unable to satisfy you at all?" Cher glared at him. "Who drugged me? Did Mrs. Lon do it for fun when Mr. Lon wasn't at home?" He said casually, then glanced at her again, and his voice became even more unhurried. "Or did you miss me? If that's what Mr. Yi thinks, I have no objections," Cher said with a fake smile. With that, she opened the car door and was about to get out. At that moment, he grabbed her slender arm and said, "Are you sure you want to go back to him?" Cher's body froze. At that moment, there was no hurt or argument between them. They were just a grown-up man and a woman. They were the most intimate people in the world. She thought that he was really good to her. If a man felt betrayed, he would still ask her if she wanted to go back to him, even when he was about to force her to abdicate. In the eyes of the outside world, she had a husband and a child. Did he still want her like that? She felt sweet and sour in her heart. Then, she pursed her lips and looked at him sideways. "Yoon, take a guess." With that, she opened the car door and got out. He didn't follow her out, but sat in the car and looked at her back. He looked at her and thought about the time they spent together after they reunited. Suddenly, he narrowed his eyes. Her waist was so slender. It was obvious that she didn't look like a woman who had given birth to a child. She was still like a young girl. And when they had sex again, he felt that she was in pain. If she had given birth naturally and maintained a long-term relationship with Lanyu, there was no reason for her to be in so much pain. She didn't look like a married woman who would fool around after getting married. And last night, although she had been drugged, she had clearly taken the initiative to pester him and ask him not to stop. All of this made him feel that her marriage with Lanyu wasn't that simple. Yoon narrowed his eyes and clenched his slender fingers. Cher walked into the hospital without a shred of hesitation. The fear she had felt the night before vanished instantly. She was no longer afraid of Lanyu. No matter how scheming Lanyu was, he had a weakness. She suddenly stopped and ran back. Yimuyun's car was still there. The window was open and he was smoking in the car. He wasn't surprised to see her come back, but just looked at her indifferently. He wasn't surprised to see her come back, but just looked at her indifferently. Suddenly, she felt that Lanyu had become a bad person. Her whole body felt relaxed. It was as if she did not owe him anything. It was as if she could turn back. But she didn't know if Yimuyun still wanted her. She felt uneasy and wanted to ask him if he could wait for her, but she was too flustered. When she asked, the meaning of her words changed. Yimuyun, will you save me again next time? His face darkened, and he put out the cigarette. Mrs. Lan, solve it yourself next time. She bit her lip and said in a delicate voice, How can I solve it myself? His face turned even darker, as though he was looking at her for the first time. Then, he sneered, I can teach you for free. With that, he started the car and left. Cher stood there, watching his car drive away. Then, she burst out laughing. Chapter 2275. When Yimuyun's car arrived at the entrance of the hospital, he suddenly stopped and let out a long sigh. He was faced with a huge temptation. He didn't know if it was poisonous, but he had already swallowed half of it. If she and Lanyu were on the same side and were deliberately lying to him, then he would probably be doomed if he swallowed another half. He leaned against the steering wheel, his head aching. There wasn't much time left. There had to be a conclusion between him, Lanyu, and Cher. If she was happy, he would let her be happy because she had a son. Even if he had to get Boyi, it was for the sake of her safety. He didn't trust anyone. What he wanted was to protect the Tang family for her, so that she would have a place to return to no matter what. Whether he was happy or not wasn't that important. Song Karen had already made him very angry. Song Karen had made him realize that he couldn't love anyone else, even if he forced it. He called Guze, arranged for someone to keep an eye on Lanyu. He paused for a moment. Also, create some trouble for Boyi. I need to make a trip to New York. Remember, the biggest shareholder has to come with me if the trouble is big enough. Guze immediately understood and nodded. Okay. Yimuyun slowly drove the car away from the hospital while Cher walked into the inpatient department. Xiao Yishu had not woken up yet and was lying on the hospital bed while Lanyu stood by the hospital window. He had probably heard the sound of the door opening because he said calmly, Who did you look for last night? He had called back to the hotel, but she hadn't returned to her room. The hotel staff were mumbling. He wasn't sure at first, but he had seen Yimuyun's car just now. What was there to be uncertain about? They had slept together last night. Lanyu turned around and looked at Snow, who was standing by the door. He smiled and said, Did you look for him? Does it matter who I slept with? Cher walked in and sat by the bed, looking at Xiao Yishu. She said in a low voice, Lanyu, aren't you tired of living in hatred? You know it's not his fault. He just rejected your sister. Lanyu's gaze was deep. You want to say return his side, huh? Cher shook her head. I'm curious. After what happened last night, why did you still dare to return to my side? Lanyu smiled faintly. Because I saved you? Cher lowered her eyes and looked at him again. Because I'm your wife on the outside. What does it mean for me to be with him now? His expression was one of disgust. You really don't hide your feelings at all. Yes, I love him. Cher was fearless. Lanyu, I've already called Yang Yani just now to announce to the public that our marriage is a misunderstanding and that it's illegal. She said word by word. I think she'd be happy to do such a thing. She had laid her cards on the table, but Lanyu was still unmoved. He looked at her quietly and pursed his lips. After a long while, he said softly, You came back just to say this? He probably knew what she was thinking. She wanted to protect that man, in her own way. He's already taking action against Bo Yi. Soon, the Tang family will no longer be Bo Yi's master. Are you sure that man loves you the most, and not Bo Yi? Cher smiled. I believe him. I'll believe him even if I die. Lanyu closed his eyes. What about me? His body shook when he asked the question. When he opened his eyes again, they were filled with shock because of what he had just said. Chapter 2276. Cher didn't say anything. She just looked at him. Lan Yu's voice was hoarse. Come back to New York with me. We'll start over. He walked over and reached out to hold her in his arms. And I'm sorry. His face was buried in her hair. She had the fragrance of a bath, but he smelled like Yi Mu-yun. Cher didn't move and let him hold her. He said softly, and I'm sorry. I won't do it again. Don't you want revenge anymore? Cher stood ramrod straight. Or do you think this is the best revenge you can get? Lan Yu closed his eyes in pain. And don't you trust me at all? No. Cher reached out to push him away. You could have never said it. Maybe we could have lived in peace forever. But you returned to be city. His voice was hoarse and angry. If you hadn't come back, we would have been very happy. What about Yang Yani? Cher sneered. What about the woman who has been with you for so many years? Where are you? Lan Yu took 2 steps back and his eyes were deep. I can let go of everything. And can you? He said word by word. For Ishu. Cher's heart twitched. It hurt. If it weren't for Ishu, she might have followed Yi Mu-yun just now. She wouldn't have come back. She pursed her lips and didn't say anything. It was a silent refusal. She said slowly, Lan Yu, I'll hold a press conference. I'll announce that our marriage is fake. Lan Yu's eyes narrowed. For Yi Mu-yun? No, it's not. She forced a smile. I'm not going to live in your hatred, and I also think that I'm no match for you. I won't put myself in danger and let you threaten him. When he stepped forward, she said softly, Lan Yu, I won't give you a chance to hurt me again. This is a hospital. Think about the consequences. Her tone was very calm. Ishu is your son. I don't think you will hurt him because of hatred. She said it very lightly, but he roughly understood what she was thinking. She was going to give up on Ishu and break up with him. Lan Yu smiled faintly. Is that so? Are you sure? Cher lowered her eyes. Lan Yu, whether it's because of a conspiracy or something else, I still have to thank you. She slowly walked to Ishu's bedside and lowered her head to kiss him. Ishu, I'm sorry. But after last night, she thought that a dysfunctional family was the greatest harm to Ishu. She pursed her lips and took a step back. Lan Yu, it's time to end this. Her eyes were watery. You have hatred in your heart, but you are still a very good person. Lan Yu's body trembled. When she was about to leave, he suddenly grabbed her hand and hugged her from behind. And haven't you thought of another possibility? Cher's body stiffened. After a long time, she said softly, Lan Yu, it's impossible for us to be together. She wasn't a fool. It wasn't that she didn't feel it, but she could even give up on Yi Mu-yun, let alone him. Chapter 2277. Lan Yu took a step back and smiled bitterly. Fine, I'll let you go. His voice was very soft. But I know you'll come back. Cher suddenly thought of Yang Yani's words. She said that the truth was right beside her. She said that Lan Yu held the most important thing in her life. She wanted to go to New York and ask Yang Yani about it. But before Cher could go to New York, before Guzei's men could find Yang Yani, she was already dead, killed by a gunshot. The beautiful woman was killed in her apartment and was not discovered until 2 days later. The only person who knew Lan Yu's secret was dead. Shui-er heard the news from Guzei. She sat in the cafe, listening to Guzei's words, and was lost in thought for a long time. A fatal shot. She couldn't find any evidence, but she knew that it was Lan Yu who did it. He was warning her that if she acted rashly, he would do anything. Cher knew about Yang Yani. She had been with him for so many years, he killed her when he said he would. What was Lan Ting's position in his heart? The domineering possessiveness that an older brother had towards his younger sister? She shuddered. Guzei said calmly, Cher, Mr. Yi hopes that you can go back. Guzei, I can't go back, Cher said calmly. Lan Yu has gone mad. He can do anything. As she said that, her hand trembled. Her cell phone rang. It was Lan Yu's phone call. Ever since Ishu went to the hospital, she had moved out of the suite and into another hotel. She picked up the phone, her body trembling. Lan Yu said calmly, Anan, Ishu misses you. Cher didn't say anything. She held the phone and waited, but he didn't hang up. After a long time, she said softly, I'll be back in a while. With that, she slowly hung up the phone. Guzei grabbed her arm. Cher, you all know. Lan Yu has gone mad. Cher looked at Guzay. You know Lan Ting, right? You went to study with him. You know that girl, right? Guzay's lips moved slightly, and his face was a little pale. He said with difficulty, Mr. Yi has nothing to do with her. It was just a story of an ignorant little girl who was too willful, and the ending was sad. But she's dead, and you don't feel anything, do you? Cher asked softly. Guzay didn't deny it. Yes, apart from Cher, Mr. Yi had a heart of stone when it came to others. Cher pursed her lips and didn't say anything. She slowly straightened her body and walked out of the cafe, faster and faster. But the door, she bumped into Yi Muyun. It was obvious that Guzay had told him she was here. They hadn't seen each other for a few days, and seeing him again felt like a lifetime had passed. I have to go back, she said softly. I'm Ishu's mother. Yang Yani was only the first. Lan Yu could do even crazier things at any time. She was starting to feel afraid. I can get him out, Yi Muyun said calmly. Cher pursed her lips. And then? Get someone to kill Lan Yu? She looked at him. Do you know that Ishu is sick? He can't bleed, and once he bleeds, he won't be able to stop it. Only Lan Yu's blood can save him. So, she had never thought of bringing Ishu with her, because that would kill Ishu. Chapter 2278. As soon as she said that, Yi Muyun's face turned extremely ugly. He stared into her eyes and asked slowly, You're saying that Lan Ishu can't stop bleeding? Cher lowered her eyes. Yes. She then looked up at him. Yi Muyun, I've let you down. Her arm was caught, and his voice was extremely gloomy. What are you going to do? Sacrifice yourself and be with Lan Yu? Huh? I don't know, but I can't let Ishu be alone with him. Cher's voice was a little choked up. Yi Muyun's eyes were burning and his heart was boiling. The only thing he could be sure of was that the little idiot in front of him didn't know anything. He had been sick before he was 10 years old, and his blood had been flowing nonstop. She was still a little girl, and he didn't mention it when he grew up. She had long forgotten about it. Now that Xiao Ishu had the same illness as him, she naturally didn't suspect anything. But he frowned and pulled her in, lowering his head to look at her. Have you ever thought about why you're so concerned about Lan Yu's son? Her lips moved slightly. You know, he's not my son. Idiot. He closed his eyes. She didn't even know if she had given birth to a child. However, he immediately recalled that there were indeed no marks on her body at that time. She had indeed not given birth to a child. So, how did she give birth to this 5-year-old child? Yi Muyun looked at her for a long time before saying indifferently, All right, I'll let you go. He slowly let go of her arm and let her disappear in front of him. But no one had expected that this short separation in his heart would turn into a long one. After Cher left, Yi Muyun turned sideways and Guzay was right behind him. Mr. Yi. Guzay's tone was indifferent. Yi Muyun said softly, Seal all the airports. Don't let Lan Yu leave the country. He guessed that Lan Yu was using Ishu to force Cher to go back to New York with him. Cher was right. This man was crazy. Guzay hesitated for a moment. What about this side? I will follow immediately. Send a few dozen people with me. As Yi Muyun spoke, he walked to the front of the car, opened the door, and got in. When he got into the car, his eyebrows suddenly twitched, as if foreshadowing that something bad was about to happen. He started to regret letting Cher go. He should have gone there himself. At that time, he was probably there for Ishu, the little fellow who was likely to be his son. Yi Muyun frowned and started the car. The sports car with good performance instantly sped up and drove toward the GM hotel. In less than 10 minutes, his car arrived at the entrance of the hotel. There was a car accident at the entrance of the hotel. One of the cars was Cher's white Porsche. When Yi Muyun's car stopped, his entire head was filled with blood. He couldn't believe that something had happened to Cher in such a short time. His throat felt like it was blocked. All the guilt he felt could not buy time, could not make him make a wrong decision. The two sports cars, one red and one white, collided head-to-head. Especially the red sports car. Half of the front of the car was smashed. The police suddenly began to evacuate the crowd. There was thick smoke coming from the front of the car. The car was about to explode. Yi Muyun rushed over there, but he was bounced back by the heat wave and fell heavily back on his own car. All the bones in his body were about to break but he still struggled to get up and prepare to rush toward the heat wave. Whether he lived or died, he wanted to be with her. Other people, other things, none of them mattered. Chapter 2279. Another huge wave rushed towards him with a bang, and he was immediately pushed back. He was pulled back and knocked out. By the time Yi Muyun woke up, the sky had already turned dark. Her throat felt like it was on fire, and her entire body was in pain, as if she was pierced into pieces. When he opened his eyes, he was a little confused, but it only took a second for him to be completely awake. Then, he lifted the quilt mechanically and walked towards the door of the ward. Before Gu Zhe could stop him, Yi Muyun spat out a mouthful of blood. Not a mouthful, but a pool of blood, black blood. He weakly leaned his head against the door and panted. "Gu Zhe, take me to see her." He didn't ask if she was dead, because deep in his heart, he couldn't accept that possibility. Gu Zhe's heart trembled, but he still quickly went forward to support him and said in a low voice, "She was saved by Lan Yu. She was only slightly injured, but she has a concussion." Yi Muyun's body softened, as if he was relieved. Gu Zhe's gaze was a little complicated, and he continued to say, "But Lan Yu," Yi Muyun narrowed his eyes. "What happened to Lan Yu?" "Lan Yu might become a vegetable," Gu Zhe said in a low voice. "The identity of the person who hit Cher has also been found out. It's Lan Ting. Lan Ting was supposed to be dead, but she didn't die. She just became a lunatic. This time, Lan Ting was completely dead. Between Cher and Lan Ting, Lan Yu saved Cher," Gu Zhe said softly. His words were neither light nor heavy, but Mr. Yi should understand the reason behind it. Lan Yu fell in love with Cher. Only when he fell in love would he make such an impulsive choice. For the past 8 years, Lan Yu lived for Lan Ting, but this time, he gave his life to Cher. Yi Muyun propped herself up and didn't collapse. She kept looking at Gu Zhe. "Bring me to see her." Gu Zhe nodded and helped Yi Muyun out of the ward. They turned a corner and came to Cher's ward. The moment the door was opened, the room was dazzlingly white, and Cher was sitting on the bed, looking a little dazed. When she heard the voice, she looked up at him, but there was nothing but unfamiliarity in her eyes. Beside him, Gu Zhe finally told him the truth. "She has forgotten only Lan Yu and Lan Yishu. Yumi, the Tang family, Qin family, and Boyi have all forgotten." Yi Muyun felt a sweet taste in his heart, and he almost spat out another mouthful of blood, but he held it in. Pursing his lips, he walked forward slowly. When he was just one step away, he reached out and pulled Cher into his embrace. At this moment, his body was trembling, and he buried his face in her neck, saying over and over again, "I'm sorry, I won't let you leave me again." He said it over and over again, but she didn't seem to notice it. After a long time, she looked up at him and called out subconsciously, "Lan Yu." Yi Muyun was stunned. Shock was written all over his face. He finally recalled what Gu Zhe had said, that she had forgotten everything except for Lan Yu. In her memory, Lan Yu was her husband, and she and Lan Yu were family. When Yi Muyun walked out of the ward, he spat out another mouthful of blood. As time passed, the truth slowly surfaced. Back then, Lan Ting, who jumped off the building because of him, did not die. She was just mentally ill, and Lan Yu had been coaxing her, using revenge in exchange for her inner peace. Chapter 2280. At that time, Lan Yu was in the same car as Lan Ting. At that time, he could have saved his sister. After all, it was the love that he had forbidden for so many years. But when he pushed open the car door with his bloody hand, what he wanted was to let Cher live. His mind was filled with images of what he had done to Shui that night. She was lying on the bed, fed by him, and he was crazy to force her to do that kind of thing. The shock in her eyes hurt his heart. He didn't want to admit that he let her go not because of Ishu, but he didn't want to hurt her in his heart. So, even though Lan Yu knew that she was drugged and would look for Yi Muyun, he still let her go. He had already surrendered to her. He didn't want to admit that he loved her. Until now, he hadn't said it. But if he was awake, if he could do it again, he probably wouldn't do this. He wouldn't let her go back to B-City. He would think a way to trick her into sleeping with him in New York. He would make the best of a mistake and live a peaceful life. Even if she always had Yi Muyun in her heart, even if she would never love him. With her by his side, watching her and Ishu together, watching them lying there together, he felt that life was a faint happiness. Mr. Yi, this is what Lan Yu asked someone to tell you before he fell into a coma, but he probably didn't expect Cher to lose her memory. Guze closed the notebook and said hesitantly, also, a document from New York has been sent over. It said that Mr. Lan Yu asked to pass it to you before he fell into a coma. Yi Muyun sat in the ward and said calmly, bring it over. Guze handed over the tightly sealed document bag and left the room. Yi Muyun looked at the closed door and opened the document. There was a thick medical record and a DNA test inside. The test was no longer important to him because he had already confirmed it. However, the medical record made him frown and close his eyes. He was in so much pain that he almost couldn't believe what was written on it. But the strength of the strokes, the wear and tear on each page, and the English words shook his soul. Depression. She had this illness before, the same illness as Chinmu. It was serious, even more serious than Chinmu's. How did she survive alone in New York? Then, she and Lan Yu might not be Lan Yu's wishful thinking. Those 5 years of love, those 5 years, they also had a child. It was something that Yi Muyun could not replace. The only thing she remembered now was Lan Yu's company. What about him? What about the 10 years they spent together? Had she forgotten all about it? After reading the documents, he finally understood why Ishu was only 5 years old and not 8. Ishu was indeed not born by Cher. When Lan Yu found her, she was pregnant and her body was indeed unable to give birth safely. The embryo was taken out and kept for 2 years using the most advanced method. During those 2 years, Xiao Ishu was still fine, but she did not grow up. In the end, Lan Yu chose a woman to implant Ishu. 8 months later, Ishu was born and was carried to Cher, saving her life. Those ice-cold words caused Yi Muyun's face to be filled with tears. You're tuning into the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.